Okay, right. Good morning, all. Werner, Gerry, thanks. We all know each other. Thanks for that lead-in. You've given us some nice information on the equipment available. Now we've got to see how we can apply it, where we can apply it, which of course is the good trick, or is the best trick, and of course then there's affordability. But turning to the panel we have this morning, General Nyembe, the Chief of Defense Intelligence, unfortunately couldn't join us, but he has recorded some comments, which we'll see first. Then I propose we'll go on to Mr. Elroy Africa, who's the head of the Border Management Agency, to discuss what the agency is going to do. And then from there go on to Advocate Bongo, who chairs the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs, to see where this fits in. And also another, I think a key aspect will also be how that committee will position itself to coordinate the multiple government departments that will be involved in this subject. So perhaps let's open with General Nyembe's inputs.
Senior officials, a facilitator, I thought I should just prepare a short discussion paper on the perspectives on securing South Africa's borders during the COVID-19 pandemic. One will have loved to be with you, but unfortunately duty calls. But I hope this document will be of use to the discussions. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic has brought particular attention to the military's capabilities to support and protect its civilian and borders. Preventing the proliferation of several threats is important for national security. This session explores the importance of securing borders for national security. Responding to the COVID-19 places severe strains on government departments the world over. The strains not only reflect an extraordinary demands on resources, but also upon decision makers and their knowledge base on how to orchestrate and align all instruments of state to mitigate its impact. One common denominator is the fact that just about every country had to take serious stock of its instruments of governance to face what has come to be seen as an existential health threat by many decision makers. Labeling COVID-19 as an existential danger opens avenues to move towards extraordinary security measures, but it simultaneously demands of decision makers in democracy to fully understand its temporal nature and bestows an even greater responsibility to forge simultaneous pathways to return to normal, as it were. The extent to which the government department that should play a leading role to mitigate health threats and its ripple effect are faced with challenges, often result in attention turning to the armed forces to bring their secondary and collateral capacity and ability to organize and deliver to the fore. Realities of military supports tend to be reflected mostly in support and policing roles and rapidly erecting temporary infrastructure to help manage the domestic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But an often obscured military contribution takes place on the outskirts of the pandemic's hotspots and its media attention. International borders are domains where the interface of human movement and countermeasures plays out. Mobility, travel, migrations, and the freedom to move across the borders are settings that facilitate the spread of disease, but simultaneously complicate ways and means to mitigate the spread. The operation of globalization challenges stances on hard national borders to ensure and protect national security. Globalization dynamics also fueled the initial spread of COVID-19 pandemic through international travel, the migration that became conducive at a time when sentiments about countering the pandemic points towards slowing or preventing such flows. One location where this preventative measure plays out is in border regions, with settings of border posts, and interconnecting lines, raising the question how to reinforce control measures in these spaces. Leaders around the world elevated COVID-19 to an existential health threat and thus opening avenues to extraordinary security measures to counter its impact among the vulnerable societies. The concept of extraordinary measures is often associated with security decisions to employ special measures where the military often forms one backdrop to conform to military cohesion, but rather calls on military to play a much more constructive and preventative role, with the latter embedded in the secondary role that all armed forces attest to and plan for during peace times, albeit often in the sidelines of the primary war-fighting focus. Chapter 2 of the South African Defence White Paper notes the turn to a broad approach to security and one strongly infused with the softer issues more prominently depicted in human security narrative. Both policy and its human security underpinnings now clearly accentuate the need and societal expectation for the South African National Defence Force to play its role to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on South African society. The South African National Defence Force has been migrating in and out of these softer roles in post-1994 South Africa. But COVID-19 is probably the acid test for this role migration. In border regions, core matters of sovereignty are upheld by also dealing with numerous non-military threats, but this is the very dynamic implied by embracing a wider and more human security concept of security, where responding to COVID-19 related insecurities now looms as a critical health security threat to national security. One such domain is borderline protection, and a role not familiar with SANDF, a role not unfamiliar to the South African National Defence Force. But COVID-19 demands on the South African National Defence Force probably questions whether it is more of the same or capabilities must become more specialized and technology infused to assist with curbing the spread of military medical capacities, or do better with its more traditional policing role to address the flow of goods and people over the country's porous borders. Under the Operation Corolla banner, much of the regulatory environment for employing the SANDF in the border control mode is in place. But COVID-19 elevated the regulatory environment beyond that of normal politics that allows decision-making space for setting in place special security measures. This decision-making space sits amongst ongoing calls in recent years for the South African National Border Safeguarding Scope to be expanded. Calls by the Secretary for Defense to increase the number of subunits deployed on the borders, as well as the 2020 budgetary allocation of additional funds for technological border safeguarding measures, attest to a decision-making domain likely to be impacted by COVID-19. While much of the current beyond normal is visible in soldiers deployed in support of the South African Police Service, the borderline protection element is equally important for the following reasons. Firstly, on the 21st July, the South African President signed the Border Management Agency Bill that allows for greater institutional cooperation to maintain secure borders with neighboring countries. Although a longer-term impact, it offers a setting to do better with securing the borders during the pandemic. The drive for a borderless Africa, including softer borders for SADC, to promote trade and people's flows, and a drive for freedom of movement must contend with COVID-19 restriction over the medium term. More scrutiny is necessary, including scrutiny of health matters for the immediate and longer term, as it remains uncertain when hard lockdowns are bound to be lifted. The traditional neutrality of local population in traditional border zones, where the history of movement rebels against imposed boundaries, only deepens the situation. This must be controlled, as such movement often circumvent formal rules and institutions. In addition, if not true physical presence, then true technologies designed for movement detection and aerial surveillance to account for the growing burden for more soldiers in South African metropoles and surroundings. Lastly, in practice, controlling the border regions connecting border posts are vulnerable zones with forward and hinterland societies representing the channels for human flows and ones in need of closer human and technological scrutiny. While soldiers are most visible on the borderline, these networks are the critical arteries that control and facilitate the human and illegal goods flows. The latter becomes all the more prevalent under conditions that limit the legal flows of commodities and opens opportunities for criminal flows to enter the bargain, as it evident from, for example, the recent growth and illegal cross-border trade in illicit cigarette following the ban on cigarette sales in South Africa. In conclusion, in securing the South African borders, the South African National Defence Force is a critical partner to secure borders through employing its knowledge and tangible resources in a secondary role. This secondary and collateral utility demands from the political and societal arenas must grab the reality of Defence Force under strain due to the overcommitments and budgetary lapses. In addition, society must understand that collateral utility implies a limited capability to play secondary but more constructive roles that benefit society more directly. While the South African National Defence Force is no stranger to protecting South Africa's borders, this role holds its own risk for soldiers, and the COVID-19 pandemic does not leave soldiers in borderline protection untouched. Turning to the argument of securing the country's borders to create safe spaces for civil society, the South African National Defence Force can play its role, but not as a lead agency and within the limitation of collateral unity and its constraints as a secondary role. This view is confirmed in the latest Border Management Authority Act, stating that, except where the Act otherwise provides, this Act does not imply the border protection function performed by the Defence Force. Under the current state of national disaster, the South African National Defence Force is not legislated to play a lead role, and this reality must register with all. The good of this is that it keeps the military profile in society low and less intrusive. Simultaneously, the South African National Defence Force must place its focus where it already has a foothold, good skills and experience gained over time, and this vein, its contribution to borderline security is such a space. I thank you.
All right. I think the General has given us some food for thought there. I think one thing that came out clearly from that, and a lot of people tend to overlook it, is that the primary purpose of having a state at all is to protect the people of that state. Normally one thinks of that against an enemy force, but it could also be in the bad old days of when we're wearing bearskins against wild animals. In this case, it's against the disease. We tend to forget this. This is the primary function of the state. Additionally, usually when something goes wrong in a country, it's the defense force that's expected to come to the party and help, whatever it is, in this case with border protection, with medical protection, others. Against that background, border is a critical part of any state. National sovereignty is an issue of border control, be it now land borders, air borders, or maritime borders. That little issue now falls neatly into the lap of the Border Management Agency. So I think initially if we can turn to Mr. Elroy Africa, who's the head of that agency, and ask him to just outline what the role of the agency will be, what its rollout plan is, because it's not going to be an easy job. If you can maybe just in a couple of minutes outline that for us, then we'll ask the advocate to maybe have a look at a more broader thing, how from his point of view, the issues are shaping up on the borders, and then we'll go into more detailed issues with both of you. Elroy, if you would go on there.
Thank you very much, Helmut, and good morning to the delegates, and also welcome to my fellow panelists, my honorable chairperson of the Portfolio Committee of Welcome to you, sir. So I think maybe Helmut and delegates, I think we just need to remind ourselves that the Border Management Authority does not yet exist. Correctly so, the President has signed and assented to the Border Management Authority Act. It is now Act number 2. But our immediate priority now is to get the President to sign a proclamation that will make this legislation operational. So that proclamation has not yet been gazetted, but that is something that we hope will be attended to quite soon. So Helmut, what do we expect from this Border Management Authority? So Home Affairs has been trusted with this responsibility of giving birth to this new organ of state. And I've been managing a project office in Home Affairs seized with this for the last 6 years. In terms of the act that has just been put on our statute books, the Border Management Authority will be responsible for what we call border law enforcement. That is terminology that we are using to describe the mandate of the BMA, border law enforcement. So General Niembe is absolutely spot on when he talks about the SANDF continuing to have the mandate for border protection. That is to protect the country from military threats. The BMA will not get involved in that. That is an exclusive mandate for the South African Defence Force. So clearly what will need to happen is that the BMA and the SANDF will need to find a way of cooperating and complementing each other. And in that regard, the BMA Act has made provision for a mandatory implementation protocol to be signed between BMA and Defence. Clearly, that will allow for the modalities of cooperation, complementarity between these two entities. I think just my second last introductory point is that the Border Management Authority, in executing its border law enforcement, it will not assume any policy-making function. I think that's important for delegates to remember. So if I give the example of which the BMA assume, that's one function it will assume. The Department of Health will continue to make policy decisions around health matters and what medication comes into the country, what goes out, what kind of medical health certificates that you need. The BMA will simply be the implementation entity that manages those controls, giving that example. So Helmut, you ask about the rollout plan. I've indicated the BMA is about to be born. We are busy preparing plans right now in the department. We've got 72 ports of entry. We've got borderline, 4,471 kilometers. We've got a coastline, 3,009 kilometers. So we have decided to take an incremental approach. That's quite important. Because this is going to be a brand new entity, we target a few ports of entry, and we're going to target a few areas within the land border law enforcement area, what we used to call the borderline. So those are, so that is the posture that we're going to adopt. We're going to target a few ports of entry as soon as possible, and we're going to start off with a couple of areas in the land borderline. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elroy. Advocate, if you can maybe give us your perspective now from the committee side, where you see how we've led up to this, things that have changed in terms of the challenges along borders, what the changes have been in the smuggling picture. One reads, for instance, quite a lot of heroin moving from Mozambique through into South Africa now for onward shipment to Europe. Issues like that which will affect things at your level, but also at your level, the committee, I suspect you're going to find you have to wind up having to do quite a lot of coordination with the other committees in Parliament that deal with the other departments involved. There are going to be quite a lot of departments involved. Could you perhaps give us a few thoughts on that just as an opener?
From our side, as the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs, we are indeed quite concerned about the issue of the borders. And what we have seen and what we have implemented in this sixth parliament was this border management bill, and which is an act now, as the president has signed it. What we envisage generally is that there's been a silos in the borders, and we have identified borders as one critical issue for the protection of the people of this country. So this act in the main will bring about 8 departments that are now found in the borders together to deal with implementation under one roof. But what is important to note is that there are about 58 pieces of legislation that we have that are managing this border control in our borders. So we have seen and agreeing that the coming into operation of this act will bring a synchronization of all these pieces of legislation into one. So what is going to be at the center of this border management authority is to make sure that we synchronize everything in protection of the South Africans. Part of what are the challenges that we have, it will be us as the country having to weigh a balance between the human rights issues that are involved in this, the economic activity that must take place. As you all are aware that the president has also signed an Africa Free Trade Agreement, which does put some challenges, and it must be implemented also without fail, because it is an agreement that we have agreed to at the level of AU. And one thing that we must balance again is our international obligations in dealing with whoever is in the country. One other challenge that we are flagging is the issue of the budgetary declines that we are seeing across departments, because for us to can deal strictly and properly with issues that relate to both the implementation of the Act and the challenges that we see and the porousness of our border and the use of technology as a force multiplier, we've got to have an increased budget. And what is at the center of this, it's us having to bring together all the sector departments that are involved as Parliament and the portfolio committees that are involved to say, how do we get all the budget of the department that are involved in the border control to start off in the implementation of this? But I must say this, that the signing of the Act, it's a very important step forward in ensuring that we address the long-standing problem that we have had of the porous borders, and the use of technology in this case will be an important step going forward, and we're looking forward in ensuring that we deal with all the other sector department and portfolio committees relating to other, like the defense, your treasury, because the customs are controlled at that level. So I think we're looking forward in the implementation, and we as Parliament will be strictly monitoring. But where there is a need to amend any other legislation to protect our borders, it's what we're going to do, because that defines the sovereignty. Thanks.
I think just before I get back to you, just one more question, Advocate. Is there maybe a point of having a permanent cooperation mechanism between the different committees involved? You have a standing meeting of each of those committees. One person may be delegated from each committee, just so you have a fairly prompt reaction to any issues that come up, and that each committee is fully aware what is bothering the others. Because all of them, you touched on funding. I mean, I know the Defense Department in particular has a heck of a problem with funding. Is there maybe a point to do something like that within Parliament?
Yes, I think we have started coordinating between particularly the Department of Defense and Treasury in terms of the implementation of this act. But part of what we need to look at the policy level, particularly the defense, because part of our view has been that we've got to transcend to a level where the defense review is able to be funded by the defense itself. We've got to create a defense that is able to be self-funding and be able to generate funds for itself to fund the programs of defense, because that will be at the center of dealing with the problem that we're having. Because the defense review that is now on the table needs a high level of funding, but from Parliament sides we have been having meetings now with other portfolio committees that relate to this matter. International relations involved, because part of issues of defense and home affairs, border control, are aligned to our obligations that we have signed internationally. So we're doing quite a lot of work in ensuring that we get this act. We think this act is in itself a force multiplier in ensuring that we attend to all the challenges that we have identified: the porous borders, the smuggling that is taking place. We're also working very close with the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs, that we need to come together and have an organized way of dealing with the challenges that we're facing as the security cluster and have one approach. Thank you.
Elroy, coming back to you. You already said that the Defence Force will continue doing what it's doing. I presume so will Treasury, so will the Police Service. Can you maybe say a little bit about how you're going to coordinate those different services that are going to be involved actually on the border? And then another factor, we are a trading nation, and hopefully as our neighbors become more prosperous, one hopes, we will trade more with them. And border controls are necessary, but on the one hand they slow down trade, and in our particular situation now, of course, with the COVID-19 virus, we have the problem that anybody wandering across a bit of border that isn't covered could infect people here. Now, I've gathered in the past that there's quite a lot of informal cross-border movement, people popping into South Africa to do some shopping, not necessarily through a border post. There are even some kids that go to school in South Africa from a neighboring country. Those are going to be problems that we face. And particularly now, dealing also with our neighboring countries, how do you envisage cooperation with their border management agencies or whatever equivalent agencies that the different countries have?
No, thank you, Helmoed. You've asked a couple of questions there. Let me start off with cooperation between the different entities that have a role to play in border security. So let us again reiterate, the Border Management Authority Act, it formally excludes the role of the SANDF from the Border Management Authority's functions. So in the act formally recognize that I will not get involved in border protection because the SANDF is the exclusive organ of state that is responsible for protecting the country's sovereignty and protecting the country from military threats. The South African Police, entity number 2, we know they are responsible for general law enforcement, and clearly there will need to also be a formal cooperation agreement. Then also, the Border Management Authority Act also formally includes customs functions of the South African Revenue Service. So what that means, it means that if we go to a port of entry in future, it is envisaged that you will only find 2 organs of state at our ports of entry. You'll find the Border Management Authority and you'll find SARS, the customs officials. And together these 2 entities as Advocate Bongo said, they would rationalize in the current 5, 6, 7, 8 that we have already into these 2 organs of state. And we think this will go a long way in streamlining command and control, improving overall management and efficiencies at our ports of entry. So the Border Management Authority Act has made it mandatory. There's a clause there which makes it mandatory for the BMA to enter into an implementation protocol with these 3 entities that I mentioned. So in other words, there must be an implementation protocol signed between the BMA and Defense, between the BMA and Police, and between the BMA and the South African Revenue Service. We've already started working on that, and we hope to conclude that. So that those instruments, those implementation protocols lead to strategic, operational, and tactical cooperation between these different entities. But also, the Border Management Authority also makes provision for oversight, political oversight. And there is a structure there established called an Inter-Ministerial Consultative Committee. This committee will be chaired by the Minister of Home Affairs, and it will be comprised of a number of other ministers, the Minister of Defense, Minister of Police, Minister of Health, and a couple of other ministers, and together they will exercise oversight over the BMA and also look at matters of cooperation. Let me quickly talk about neighboring countries. So we've got 6 neighboring countries, and quite clearly the BMA will need to interact with these 6 neighboring countries and their law enforcement entities when it comes to border management. Already we have had briefing sessions with these relevant entities. We started about 2 or 3 years ago. And even right now, as I'm speaking to this conference, we have established what we call joint technical working groups with at least 5 of our 6 neighboring countries. And these joint technical working groups at the level of officials, they are focused on establishing what we call one-stop border posts. So we have identified 6 commercial ports of entry that we believe modernized, they need to be overhauled, and they need to assist us with seamless movement of people and trade, but also strength security. So clearly the BMA will in future take responsibility for managing those one-stop border posts, but I can assure you that already we are well with our neighboring countries, and they have already been briefed on this initiative. Thank you.
Okay, one, if I may,
That's insightful and very informative panel discussion. I would request the panelists not to leave the stage, if I can call it that, because there's a Q&A session. We'll only have time for one question, and we'll make it very relevant to what is currently happening in the country of lockdown. The first question is, or the only question is, what sort of change has there been to smuggling patterns, especially with regards to cigarette and alcohol smuggling, as well as other drugs?
Well, I think that is probably not in my portfolio, but would be either Elroy, if he has insight into that already, or maybe the advocate from the parliamentary side, having looked at the overall problem, is possibly the best person to answer that one.
Elroy, advocate,
Should I come in?
Yes, please, Elroy, please come in.
Okay. No, thank you for that question. So I think it's important to start off by reminding ourselves that all our ports of entry are closed for normal movement. Right now, we have only kept a few ports open for the movement of goods, good movements. And of course, there are also exceptions around repatriation and evacuations. But all normal movement for leisure, the ports are completely closed for that. So definitely what we have seen around some of our major ports like Beitbridge, like the Bongo, like Maseru Bridge, we have unfortunately seen the movement of people illegally across the borderline, the land border enforcement area. And again, through Operation Corona, we know that the SANDF is doing its best to kind of manage, the cross-border movement. We also know that one of the hotspot areas is the area in northern KwaZulu, between South Africa and Mozambique. That area has been a particular problem when it comes to cross-border crime, and especially vehicles getting stolen and hijacked in South Africa and taken through the borderline there. But again, we know that the South African police, the SANDF, even the province of KwaZulu-Natal, they've even assisted in putting up infrastructure there. We've increased the deployment of soldiers in the area, and we've seen a significant drop in cross-border crime in that area. But the point that I'm raising is that with all of entry close movement in some of the countries that I've mentioned, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Mozambique, unfortunately, we are beginning to see movement close to our major ports of entry across the kind of borderline. Thank you.
Elroy, thank you for that. We literally have a minute to go before we go into the networking sessions. I'll allow that minute to be consumed by the advocate. Maybe just 1 minute quickly.
Thank you very much. I think I agree with what Elroy is raising. You see, with the coming in of the Border Management Authority, we will have to deal with all the other issues that comes in on an incremental basis. We have received complaints and cases wherein there's been problems in the Bay Bridge. There've been problems in the Libombo, the Mozambican side. So the incremental nature of what we're going to be dealing with, it will focus on those kind of areas in terms of the challenges that are there. And we have, as the Parliament, received commitments from the department, from the police side, from the defense side, that there are some force multipliers in terms of the use of technology that have been employed in trying to cap the issue of the smuggling of cigarettes and alcohol, particularly in the Libombo border post and the Bay Bridge. So we think there's quite progress that we're dealing, but like I've said, that the act coming into operation will alleviate a lot of the problems that we're facing.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Helmoed, Elroy, advocate, and the Lieutenant General. We're about to go into our networking sessions, so that as the tables that you're in, you're able to discuss this matter further. Could we then please come back at 5 to 11? So off to you into your tables and your networking sessions to be able to discuss the issue of border control.